Hello, Peter. Thank you. There are handouts here by the coffee pot if you need a handout. I'll give you all one since y'all are walking that way. I'm going to put this right on your table. You're welcome. Well, welcome back. If you were with us last week, you were here for the start of our series on Womanist Midrash. If you weren't here and you enjoyed today, I've got good news. We're going to do it again in the new year. This is a series that we're splitting up 2 weeks today, 2 weeks this month, and then in January we're going to do 2 more weeks. The author of this text, this book, A Womanist Midrash, is Dr. Wilda Gaffney. Dr. Gaffney will be our Tippy speaker in March. She's already got it on her website, so she's looking forward to coming with us, and I'm looking forward to having her. If you were with this class, I don't know, back in the spring semester, maybe during the summer, I can't remember exactly when, but we looked at a couple of Dr. Gaffney's sermons. We actually watched the sermon text and then listened to what she would say and just sort of discussed it. She might be the Tippy speaker for which we've done the most prep work, partly because I think her voice and her contribution is really important, but it's also the kind of work, the kind of contribution that's worth getting ready for. So we're spending some time getting to know her. Last week we looked at two examples of Midrash that she does from the first 5 books of the Bible, the Torah, the Pentateuch. Today we're going to look at 2 examples from the historical text, sort of the time of the monarchy, and that's what we'll get to today. But before we do that, somebody was asking about what is Midrash, and so let me zoom in a little bit so this is a little easier to see. Right, let me just read what Gaffney writes. In Jewish sacred literature, Midrash is the primary rabbinic term for exegesis. In biblical Hebrew, the verb darush means to seek. Later, it would become specifically to exegete. A midrash is its derived noun. Traditional midrash is also mystical, imaginative, revelatory, and above all, religious. Midrash interprets not only the text before the reader, but also the text behind and beyond the text, and the text in between the lines of the text. In rabbinic thinking, each letter and the spaces between the letters are available for interpretive work. The thing I want to hold to you is that even though this is strange in our tradition, we don't do this a lot in the Christian tradition, Midrash is, as Dr. Gaffney puts it, above all else, religious work. It is faithful work. It is not mere storytelling. It is not to confuse the text or to change the text. It is actually to ask of the text more than it could give if it were not for that mystical, imaginative, faithful approach. As she writes elsewhere, there are rules for Midrash. This is a highly structured and governed process, and yet it is artful and spirit-led. Midrash is central to the Jewish way of thinking. It is central to understanding what God is saying in the Torah. So, for example, an example of this form of interpretation is to look at some of the laws in the Torah and to try to understand how are we supposed to apply those laws to present-day circumstances. And Midrash is one way of allowing those texts to take on new life, new meaning, and yet still remain faithful. So I want you to hold on to the fact that this is a faithful practice as well as an imaginative one. This text, Womanist Midrash, you can buy it online. It reads less like a textbook or a novel and more like an encyclopedia. It's easier to kind of pick from the different sections than it is to read cover to cover, though every word is of value, and I commend it to you. So it is absolutely worth your attention. Last time we looked at the stories of the midwives in Egypt, Shiphrah and Puah, the women who were told by Pharaoh to kill all of the male children who were born, but to let the females live. And Shiphrah and Puah, in their faithfulness and their strength, resist that commandment and do so with some wonderful guile. And it's a great text. And even though they only get about 2 verses in the Bible, we know that a lot must go on for those women to save all of the male children born in Egypt, and to do that in the face of the one who claims godlike power, which is Pharaoh. And so Midrash allows us to imagine more to their story. They come alive to us. We also looked at, who's the other person we looked at? Shiphrah, Puah, and, not Bathsheba. Remind me who it was? Thank you, Miriam. Yes, thank you. Aaron's sister, thank you. Moses' sister. And Moses' sister, Aaron's sister dared to question Moses and is stricken with leprosy. And then the biblical text tells us things like they waited 7 days until she had been purified, and then they marched on. But looking between the text, between the letters of the text, allows us to hear not only a woman who dared to question Moses and was stricken with leprosy because of it, but we get to hear in that text the faithfulness of Israel to remain with Miriam, to refuse to allow that leprosy to define her or define her ministry, to hold to account Moses, who had abandoned his first wife in favor of another. So there's a lot more to it if we allow the text to do that. So this week we're going to look at 2 different texts, the story of Michal and the story of Tamar. But let's start with a prayer, and in place of our typical kind of prayer, I'm going to ask us to read this canticle. It is a canticle from Enriching Our Worship, which is a series of liturgical texts. And this is a canticle that is authored by Julian of Norwich, a mystic from many centuries ago. And it is called A Song of True Motherhood. There at the top of your handout or on the screen, let's read that canticle as a prayer together. God chose to be our mother in all things, and so made the foundation of his work most humbly and most pure in the virgin womb. God, the perfect wisdom of all, arrayed himself in this humble place. Christ came in our poor flesh to share a mother's care. Our mothers bear us for pain and for death. Our true mother, Jesus, bears us for joy and endless life. Christ carried us within him love and travail until the full time of his passion. And when all was completed and he had carried us so for joy, still all this could not satisfy the power of his wonderful love. All that we owe is redeemed in truly loving God. For the love of Christ works in us. Christ is the one whom we love. Thank you. Today we're going to look first at the story of Michal. This is one of Saul's daughters, and she is, unlike most of the women in the Hebrew Bible, in the Old Testament, she has a lot to say. And there's a lot going on with Michal. But let's read not her whole story because we don't have time to read all of it, but let's read 2 sections of her story. One early in our understanding of who Michal is, and then second, the end of Michal's recorded story. And then we'll look at some of what Will Gaffney says about her to help us understand that story more fully. Who would read for us the first paragraph, that is 1 Samuel 19, 11 through 17? Who would read that using the microphone? Thank you.
Saul sent messengers to David's house to watch him, that he might kill him in the morning. But Michal, David's wife, told him, "If you do not escape with your life tonight, tomorrow you will be killed." So Michal let David down through the window, and he fled away and escaped. Michal took an image and laid it on the bed and put a pillow of goat's hair at his head and covered it with clothes. And when Saul sent messengers to take David, she said, "He is sick." Then Saul sent the messenger to see David, saying, "Bring him up to me in the bed, that I may kill him." And when the messengers came in, behold, the image was in the bed with the pillow of goat's hair at its head. Saul said to Michal, "Why have you deceived me thus, and let my enemy go, so that he has escaped?" And Michal answered Saul, "He said to me, 'Let me go, why should I kill you?'"
Thank you. And who would read the second paragraph for us? Thank you. And before she reads that, let me remind you that Michal is Saul's daughter. So this is father speaking to daughter, saying, bring me your husband so that I may kill him. So it's a complicated family system, but just so you'll remember that Saul was Michal's father. All right, thank you, Jane. Would you read that next bit for us?
As the ark of the Lord came into the city of David, Michal, the daughter of Saul, looked out of the window and saw King David leaping and dancing before the Lord, and she despised him in her heart. And David returned to bless his household, but Michal, the daughter of Saul, came out to meet David and said, how the king of Israel honored himself today, uncovering himself today before the eyes of his servants, female servants, as one of the vulgar fellows shamelessly uncovers himself. And David said to Michal, it was before the Lord who chose me above your father and above all his house to appoint me as prince over Israel, the people of the Lord. And I will celebrate before the Lord. I will make myself yet more contemptible than this, and I will be abased in your eyes. But by the female servants of whom you have spoken, by them I should be held in honor. And Michal, the daughter of Saul, had no child to the day of her death.
Thank you. All right, let's just start with the surface. I'm going to ask you about these two passages. You might remember some of what comes in between them, and feel free to bring that. But if you don't remember that, don't worry. Let's just start with what we've got. What do you notice? How would you characterize the Michal of the first passage, and how would you characterize the Michal of the second passage? How would you describe them? And raise your hand, and the microphone will come to you. Who would answer that for us? Yeah, thank you, Marthy. Trent, would you mind running the microphone for us today? Thank you. That'd be a gift. Thank you.
Well, she seems like a concerned wife, shall we say, and she's trying to save his life.
Yes.
But
In the first passage.
That's in the first passage.
Yeah.
In the second passage, not so much. So she's looking out her window, and she sees him leaping and dancing before the Lord, and it says she despised him in her heart. And he's, I'm not sure exactly what he's wearing, but not very much, so that it's kind of revealing when he's dancing around.
Yeah. Yeah, my mother told me that unless you're at a beach or a pool, don't ever take your shirt off in a public place. Like, that's just part of what I grew up being told. I grew up, don't ever take your shirt off where other people can see you unless you're at the beach or at a pool. It's just unseemly. And apparently he's dancing in his underwear. He's so excited, he's thrown off his royal robes and he's dancing around in his undergarments, if you will. Yeah.
And I would just say that probably most married people have had an episode where their spouse did something that...
Yeah, you put your head in your hands. Yeah.
Right.
But you name for us kind of the devotion in the first bit and the scorn in the second bit, and I bet you're willing to believe that it's not just these two episodes where that transition happens. Like, something's happening between the first and the second. Yeah. What else do you hear? How else would you describe the Michal? Thank you, Lori and then George. How else would you describe how Michal is depicted for us? Imagine, if you will, what's going on in her world that this is what we hear and see. Yeah.
I see her as a woman who's following her own moral compass, and she doesn't care what the powerful men around her are going to think. She's bold.
Yeah. Thank you. Boldness. Yeah, and behind you. That's what George would say. All right, yeah. Yeah, anything else that you would notice? Yeah, over here. Thank you.
Perhaps is this on?
Yeah.
Okay. Perhaps Michal has jealousy inside of her, because David his eyes have not been just for her, and maybe she had expected that to begin with, and she was hurt. Her heart was hurt, and that's why she started expressing herself this way.
Yeah. Thank
Perhaps.
you. Yeah, I think that's great insight. Let's let that be our transition. And if you'll turn ahead in the text and get to the book text, the photocopy of the book text on page 196. And I wonder if somebody would read for us that first line on page 196 where the new sentence begins, I believe that the reason Michal despises David Would someone read that all the way through that paragraph that starts on page 197, the one that ends, surely Ahinoam shared her mother wit, her womanist ways with her daughters? Who would read that bit from Dr. Gaffney? Then we'll read the italicized text next. Who might read that bit for us? And if you get to a name you don't know, just say it. We'll all be impressed if you say it with confidence. Who would read that bit for us, please? Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you. Start with, I believe that the reason Michal despises David, right at the top of 196. Yep, thank you.
I believe that the reason Michal despises David is that after all she has done for him, after taking and using her love to escape from and ultimately succeed her father on the throne, he has abandoned her. David has moved on to other women and other children. He will not return to her bed. He will not father children with her. She is a living widow. Watching him woo, seduce, and impregnate women all around her, Michal, who has used her agency in the narrative to defy and deceive her father, has lost that agency. She has been passed from man to man and now finds herself retrieved like property, but not rescued to the loving embrace of the man she once loved. Michal uses her voice for the last time in the scriptures to tell David about himself in 2 Samuel 6:20. How the king of Israel honored himself today, stripping today before the eyes of the slave girls of his slaves, as any empty fellow might strip, uncovering himself. David's response does not acknowledge her feelings for him, her actions on his behalf, her suffering on his behalf, any indebtedness to or care for her at all. Instead, he taunts her with his theology that it was God who elevated him at her father's expense, somewhat inverting the narrative in which he descends through a window with her help. And about those slave girls enslaved to his slaves, the lowest of the low, especially compared to a king's daughter, David says to Michal in verse 22, I will make myself yet more accursed than this, and I will be degraded in my own eyes, and with the slave girls of whom you speak, with them I shall be honored. In other words, I have yet to begin to debase myself. I'll do so with whomever I choose, anyone but you. And they, slaves of slaves, those girls are just my speed. No matter what I do, they'll cheer me on, and they'll like it. David and the text turned from Michal, her living widowhood, inscribed for perpetuity in verse 23. And Michal bat Shaul did not have a child to the day of her death.
Ahinoam bat Ahimaaz.
There you go. And her daughters, Merab bat Ahimaaz and Michal bat Ahimaaz, have passed from the gaze of the biblical editors. They are no longer of interest to those whose focus is on David as the anointed Messiah, King of Israel. But they are still of interest to me. Contemplating the relationship between Ahinoam and her daughters Merab and Michal fires my midrashic womanist imagination. How did this seasoned royal woman prepare her daughters for their roles as royal women, first as daughters, then wives? And how did she think of the young David as fiancé to both of her daughters, of Michal's love for him? Could her mother's eyes see the selfishness underneath the beauty of David? How does she respond to Saul's changing moods, rages, threats, and curses? Was she able to remain in her daughters' lives after their marriages? Was she there for Merab after David and her children and her grandchildren murdered?
That's okay, just keep going.
Was she there for Michal when David replaced and abandoned her? I believe Ahinoam and her own well of wisdom and experience in sharing a king with other women. She shared Saul with Rizpah bat Ahi, and there were other women. Surely Ahinoam shared her mother's wit, her womanist ways with her daughters.
Thank you. That was a lot to read, and I appreciate you doing that so well. What'd you hear? What'd you notice? What does Dr. Gaffney help us see that the text doesn't tell us, but actually it doesn't, you don't have to dig very deep to hear this, do you? You don't have to dig very deep to see this. She's not making this stuff up. She's just helping us see it. She's shining a light on it. What does Dr. Gaffney shine a light on for you in your reading today? Yeah.
right there at the beginning. He doesn't acknowledge her feelings.
Yeah. Michal is the only woman in the Hebrew Bible who is said to have loved someone else. She's the only one. She is the only woman to ever be described as having love for her partner, her spouse. The only time in the whole Bible, the Hebrew Bible, that a woman loves. And yet David requites her love, rejects her love. A love that would have her choose her husband over her father, to hide him, to get him out the door lest he be killed. And yet David's response is to collect wives like he's collecting those little shot glasses from Stuckey's across the South, right? Yeah. But does anybody stop to care about her feelings? No, right? The biblical text almost announces it as if it were a curse. She did not have any children for the rest of her life. But Gaffney helps us realize that the reason she didn't have any children is because David wouldn't sleep with her. She's not barren. She is never described as barren. So because she is of childbearing age, the fact that she didn't have children is a sign to us that David refused to have sex with her, refused to honor her identity as the wife of the king. I mean, there are other political histories in which kings refuse to have children by their wives, right? But what does that tell us about David? And that's not in the text. David, as she says so beautifully, is the anointed one. We don't care about her. Let's hear about him. And yet, she's a person, a woman with story and feelings unlike any other woman in the Bible. Isn't that amazing? What's your response to that? Yeah, George.
Oh, thanks. Appreciate it. That was magical. To me, there's an underlying text, and that is that, first of all...
Hold that microphone right up to your mouth because we can't hear
sorry
you.
about this. First of all, why, if you think about it, why do a few men have a lot of wives? For me, that's the sign of total injustice in the system, because there are other men that are with no wives because of it. So underlying that, and to keep that system, you blunt your feelings. So the very fact that she loved and made emotional demands on David was one reason for him to reject her. She was basically threatening the whole way men and women reacted. Women are subservient, and so for her to even express love to him is a cloying thing for him. But also, of course, like a guy going through med school and his wife puts him through it, and then he divorces her when he gets a med degree. Reminds me of that. She saved him, she helped him out, and now he wants to forget that and live the life that he thinks he's entitled to.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. What else? What else is your response? Yeah. Oh, we need it because otherwise they can't hear you online. Thank you.
David is a cad.
He's a cad.
He is a forgiven cad, but he's a cad.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. What I think is interesting is how easily we, as the recipients of this text, who name the biblical text as being holy and sacred in God's Word, how easily we receive a story that is only told through a very narrow and very a biased lens. Right? We don't hear. It takes Midrash, and it takes not just Midrash, but in this case, a womanist Midrash, someone who thinks and believes that the stories of women in the Bible, their stories help us know who God is better than we would be able to know God with only the biblical text. That's a commitment. That's a commitment that Gaffney makes, and it's a commitment that Gaffney invites us to make as well. Right? The biblical text, although we would affirm it contains all things necessary to salvation, that's a very Episcopal or Anglican way of thinking about the Old and New Testament, Gaffney would tell us that it's not finished, it's not complete in that way, surely. Yeah. What else? Any other responses? She becomes a person, a human, right? You don't need a psychology degree to understand that the woman who loved her husband, as we see in the first passage, ends up despising him in the second passage. And not just because he's running around in his underwear, right? There's so much more going on. Who would read for us the italicized text, which starts in the middle of 197 and carries over just a couple of lines on 198? Who would read that italicized text for us? Pretty please. This is her Midrash on these three characters, Ahinoam, Merab, and Michal. Who would read that for us, please? Thanks, Adeline.
Michal sobs inconsolably. Only tears have bathed her face in recent days. Her hair hasn't been oiled or twisted. Such sleep as she has had has been from exhaustion, fitful, fleeting. At other times, she falls deathly silent, staring at something no one can see. Then she talks to herself, or someone else. The servants make the sign of the evil eye behind her back. They say she is as mad as her father, that David is better off without her. The only one who can calm her, feed her, bathe her, hold her, is her mother. There are no I told you so's, even though she did tell her that something about that boy just wasn't right. Pretty is as pretty does, and God don't like ugly. Now there was just, hush, baby, Mama's here. Her arthritis-swollen fingers untangling the tightly wound coils of her daughter's hair, as she had when she was a child, cradled between her thighs. How she wished she were as active as she was then. She had to cross her ankles around her to hold her still to finish her hair, her beautiful hair. She had been tearing it out since they had taken her scissors and knives. After she had cut it, and more that last time, best not to think about that. Having soothed Michal, Ahinoam goes to Merav's room. She had come home to Mama after David manipulated the Gibeonites into killing her babies, all of them. Merav couldn't stay in that house after that. Her husband used to come regularly, coaxing her to return, but we haven't seen him around here in a while. Merav is on the terrace pulling up flowers and weeds together, tearing at their leaves and petals and flinging them as far away as she can. Ahinoam sits wincing and waits. She aches to take her firstborn in her arms, but this child of hers can no longer stand to be touched and will not even meet her eyes. So she waits, wondering who will mother these daughters that David has broken after her death.
Thank you. Let's move on to the second story. The story of Tamar. If you don't know the story of Tamar, Tamar is raped in the story. So if that's a difficult thing for you to hear, especially in a group setting, just know that we're going to hear the story of Tamar's rape. It's also an incestual rape, so if that's also something that you are sensitive to, feel free to get a cup of coffee and stretch your legs out in the hallway. You're welcome to stay, of course, but I want you to know that that is what we're reading straight out of the Bible today. Who would read for us? Let's split it in half since a lot of text. Who would read for us the first two paragraphs of 2 Samuel 13? Who would read those first two paragraphs for us on the handout? Thank you, Lori. And who will pick up when Lori's finished and read the last two paragraphs, verses 15 through 22? Who would read that for us? David, would you read that for us, McMath? Since you're there, thank you. We'll come to you in a minute. So much for the crossword puzzle. Go ahead, Lori.
Now Absalom, David's son, had a beautiful sister whose name was Tamar. And after a time, Amnon, David's son, loved her. And Amnon was so tormented that he made himself ill because of his sister Tamar, for she was a virgin. And it seemed impossible to Amnon to do anything to her. But Amnon had a friend whose name was Jonadab, the son of Shimeah, David's brother. And Jonadab was a very crafty man. And he said to him, "O son of the king, why are you so haggard morning after morning? Will you not tell me?" Amnon said to him, "I love Tamar, my brother Absalom's sister." Jonadab said to him, "Lie down on your bed and pretend to be ill. And when your father comes to see you, say to him, 'Let my sister Tamar come and give me bread to eat, and prepare the food in my sight, then I may see it and eat it from her hand." So Amnon lay down and pretended to be ill. And when the king came to see him, Amnon said to the king, "Please, let my sister Tamar come and make a couple of cakes in my sight, that I may eat from her hand." Then David sent home to Tamar, saying, "Go to your brother Amnon's house and prepare food for him." So Tamar went to her brother Amnon's house, where he was lying down, and she took dough and kneaded it and made cakes in his sight and baked the cakes. And she took the pan and emptied it out before him, but he refused to eat. And Amnon said, "Send out everyone from me." So everyone went out from him. Then Amnon said to Tamar, "Bring the food into the chamber, that I may eat from your hand." And Tamar took the cakes that she had made and brought them into the chamber to Amnon her brother. But when she brought them near him to eat, he took hold of her and said to her, "Come, lie with me, my sister." She answered him, "No, my brother, do not violate me, for such a thing is not done in Israel. Do not do this outrageous thing. As for me, where could I carry my shame? And as for you, you would be as one of the outrageous fools in Israel. Now, therefore, please speak to the king, for he will not withhold me from you." But he would not listen to her, and being stronger than she, he violated her and lay with her.
Thank you. David?
Then Amnon hated her with a very great hatred, so that the hatred with which he hated her was greater than the love with which he had loved her. And Amnon said to her, "Get up, go." But she said to him, "No, my brother, for this wrong is sending me away. This wrong in sending me away is greater than the other that you did to me." But he would not listen to her. He called the young woman who served him and said, "Put this woman out of my presence and bolt the door after her." Now she was wearing a long robe with sleeves, for thus were the virgin daughters of the king dressed. So his servant put her out and bolted the door after her. And Tamar put ashes on her head and tore the long robe that she wore. And she laid her hand on her head and went away, crying aloud as she went. And her brother Absalom said to her, "Has Amnon your brother been with you? Now hold your peace, my sister. He is your brother. Do not take this to heart." So Tamar lived, a desolate woman, in her brother Absalom's house. Then King David heard all these things. He was very angry. But Absalom spoke to Amnon neither good nor bad, for Absalom hated Amnon because he had violated his sister Tamar.
Thank you. We don't read that story in Sunday school all that often. You might be as surprised as I am that the biblical text preserves it. I don't know about you, but usually when I think about writing my family history, I choose not to write the really difficult bits, but that'll say something about our collective desire to hide our shame. Generationally, I celebrate that this story is preserved so that we can see it and know that sexual violence is not a new thing and that families perpetuate sexual violence in horrible ways. And although difficult to hear, I think it's important that we hear this text. What do you notice? How do you receive that terrible text today? How do you hold that story today? Yeah. Here it comes.
So just like in the Bible, today in a lot of cultures, they practice the same thing, which is to put all the blame on the woman for the situation, which is just insanely unfair to her.
Yep. We read of her shame. We don't read of her brother's shame. Even though she named it, we don't read about his shame. Yeah, what else? Yep, George?
That follows the way that the patriarchy is constructed there. It's not that big a deal. She got raped. It ruins her life.
Yeah.
It's just not that big a deal.
Yeah, the text would have us believe that. Yeah, thank you. How else do you receive that story today? How else do you receive that story? We aren't going to read the second part of this chapter in the Bible. If you go and read the second part of this chapter, you'll see that Absalom waited and then murdered his brother Amnon, so he gets vengeance for his sister. We do read that he hated her, but the vengeance comes later on. We're not going to read that part of the story, but let's read a little bit of what Dr. Gaffney writes about this. In the interest of time, since I'm a particularly quick reader, I'm going to read, starting in the middle of 232. Do you see 232? I'm going to read from the middle of 232 much of the public discourse, and I'm going to read for a little bit, so follow along with me. And those of you watching online, I don't have this to broadcast for you, so just listen to these words. This is what Dr. Gaffney highlights from this story. Much of the public discourse around sexual violence against women and children centers on stranger danger, unknown sexual predators, and to some degree, date rape by current and prospective intimate partners. Meanwhile, the role of family members in these crimes has been more likely to be addressed on TV talk shows and crime dramas than sermons or congregational education programs. But there are perpetrators in all of our communities. They are in our neighborhoods, schools, churches, synagogues, mosques, community programs, and families. Most often, perpetrators of sexual violence prey on the trust and bodies of their own family members and friends. Sexual offenders are not all lone wolves. As the biblical account of Jonadab's collaboration illustrates, there are other family members, adults, who know that a child or woman or man is being abused. They say nothing, or even worse, they participate. They exist and operate in a broader society that sexualizes women and girls, particularly black and brown women and girls. In addition to rape culture, black women and girls are subject to misogynoir, unflinching hatred directed toward black women that is racist, misogynistic, and usually expressed in sexually explicit terms. While the term misogynoir is new, it describes a long-standing institutionalized set of demeaning and degrading practices in the West targeting black girls and women. Those practices include denigration of the black female body on film and in larger pop culture, the impetus for coining the word misogynoir. These phenomena are particularly prevalent in the Americas and other former slave-holding nations. The combination of rape culture and misogynoir produces a portrait of black girls and women as sexually voracious and promiscuous. That characterization has meant that black women in the United States were not deemed to be rapeable, that is, they could not be raped because they were perpetually available, incapable of withholding consent. The legacy of that ideology has meant that the testimony of black girls and women who have been raped is regularly and repeatedly disregarded by family, friends, the legal system, and the wider society. Many religious communities and institutions participate in rape culture by disbelieving women and girls, ostracizing them if they report, and blaming them for their assaults, often while embracing accused and repeat offenders in their midst. The prevalence of rape, antagonistic treatment of victims and survivors by police and judicial systems, low levels of convictions, and brevity of sentences when convicted combine to shape the contours of a rape culture that is not limited to the United States. The conspiracy to set Tamar up to be raped with impunity is a scriptural mirror illuminating acts of complicity in our own communities. Let me take you back to the text for a moment just to highlight what that means, because sometimes we don't notice it in the text. But anyone who loved someone enough to be tormented to the point of making himself ill, that love is not a secret. That love is not a surprise. And so when Amnon reaches out to his friend Jonadab is a conspirator in this. He wants his friend to have what his friend wants. He doesn't like his friend's unrequited lust. And so as a result, this friend conspires to have Tamar raped. He doesn't use a date rape drug, but essentially that's what's happening in this text. Notice later on, not only do we see that David is a participant in this. David sent home to his daughter saying, go to your brother's house. We are left to wonder, what did David know? What did David expect? What was David offering when he told his daughter Tamar to go to her brother's house? And do we have enough confidence that David would have thought of Tamar as a full human being of equal value as his son, that David would have recognized what was happening and recognized the horror that was going to unfold? Notice then later on, right? Notice later on we see, let me see where I find it. We see that David heard these things. He was angry. But Absalom spoke to Amnon. He was angry, but he doesn't do anything about it. In fact, if you read the rest of the story of David, Absalom's his favorite. He will almost lose his whole kingdom because of his favorite son, Absalom. So convoluted and obscured is the truth, the recognition of this rapist, his own son, that he would not only move on, but also pursue in love that one who had caused the destruction of his family, even the death. Even after his own son's death, Absalom's not the rapist, I apologize. Let me withdraw that. When David heard these things, he was angry, but he doesn't do anything about it. It's his son, in fact, his favorite son, Absalom, and maybe that's perhaps some of the reason that he is that favorite son, because he reacts violently to Amnon, who was the rapist. Turn the page over, and let's hear another voice who would read for us the italicized text. Right? And you'll notice that Dr. Gaffney uses a version of these Hebrew names that is closer to the Hebrew pronunciation, Avshalom, made Yonadav. Who would read that italicized text? And then you'll see at the top of 235 the rest of the italicized text. Who would help us hear this? And we're going to skip this part of the text, but she's focusing her Midrash on the complicity of the family. She's wanting us to recognize with horror how easily systems perpetuate this kind of violence against women when women, especially black and brown women, are thought of as being less than human, which is our national story. Who would read the italicized bits for us, pretty please? Thank you, Marthy.
Avshalom made Yonadav suffer as Tamar suffered. He made him scream as Tamar screamed. Avshalom left what was left of Yonadav, in a pile of torn and tattered flesh, shredded like the remains of Tamar's royal dress, and walked away. Someone else would have to clean that mess up.
And then I give Tamar the final word, a prayer and prophetic curse. Read the next bit for us at the top of 235, please.
You want me to keep going?
Keep going, please.
Cursed be Amnon, who lay with his sister, who ravaged her, the daughter of his father. Let heaven and earth bear witness of what you have done to me. Cursed shall you be in the city, and cursed shall you be in the field. Cursed shall be your basket and your kneading bowl. Cursed shall be the seed of your loins, the fruit of your ground, the increase of your cattle, and the issue of your flock. Cursed shall you be when you come in, and cursed shall you be when you go out. Now therefore you are cursed bitterly, because you ravaged and savaged your sister. Therefore all women will turn from you, and men will play you false until you pay for your crime against me and against God, with your blood poured onto the earth to satisfy the blood of my virginity. I curse you with a curse, and you are accursed.
Thank you. I'm grateful that Gaffney helps us hear the voices of those whose voices aren't expressed in the biblical text. What else would you note about Gaffney's assessment? How do you receive the work that she's doing in this text as important work for us today? Trent?
So I haven't read this in a while, and I'm not certain I remember all the original details of the story, but it was included for a reason, I assume, to make a statement, although that statement in the text as we have it is somewhat ambiguous. Mm-hmm. And she brings to light a little less of a disambiguous understanding of why that text was retained and included. That's my assumption.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I agree. I think that's right. I think the text allows us to see the horror, at least on the surface, of what Amnon does. It allows us to see Absalom, who takes his life, who murders him because of it. But it doesn't really give us a chance to hear from Tamar, to hear her anguish. It doesn't give us a chance to reconcile with those who facilitated this sex crime. And Midrash allows us to do that. Otherwise, if we arrest one person but we don't pay attention to all those who enabled that crime to happen, we're not actually honoring victims or fixing the system. Yeah, which is often what we do, especially in churches and families. Yeah, right. What else? Yeah, George, Martha, and then George, since Martha's closer. Yeah.
I just want to say that I think that there was really a habit, a pattern of, let's call it mildly, sexual misbehavior. We know what happened. I mean, and it goes on with David, and I can't think of their names right now, but she sent, David became involved with this beautiful woman he saw bathing from the window.
Bathsheba, yeah.
Bathsheba, thank
yeah.
you. And so eventually he sent Bathsheba's husband into battle and for him to be put where he would certainly be killed.
Yes.
And, it just goes on from there.
Mm-hmm.
And when I last studied this, we talked a lot about family dynamics and bad habits
Mm-hmm.
and sin getting passed down, and it's just what you see with David.
Mm-hmm.
He's got this great reputation, but if you really read the texts, he was not such a nice guy.
Yeah.
Apart from that beautiful time when he's, chosen by Samuel. Is it Samuel? And blessed. He's the youngest
Sure.
of the brothers.
Yep.
And you think, oh, what a lovely story.
Yeah.
Not so lovely.
Yeah, not so lovely. Thank you, George. He's a cad. A forgiven cad, perhaps, but a cad. It is hard to say the one after God's own heart when we read these stories and take them seriously. That's a challenge. Yeah. Yes.
I think many people in the tribe accepted him being a cad, and it didn't bother them. In other words, that was part of being. This is all a warrior society, basically. Fortunately, we've evolved a little bit from that sometimes, but even now we see prominent political figures who demean women and are looked up to. They might have violated several women, and they're still. And it's almost as if a portion of our citizenry say, well, yes, and so what? Because important thing is that we be strong. And a strong man doesn't understand what the woman, in fact, that's a distraction. So a strong man can affect all these emotions when he's young, and David can write beautiful poetry, but when he grows up and is a boss and he has to follow that path, he is all of a sudden a desensitive cad, as you said. But he's not alone. This is this is structured. And it takes a person that goes for revenge, not for justice. Of course, it is justice in that case to kill the perpetrator. But that's the system they have, as in the Greek tragedies. Somebody has to avenge the death rather than the society taking care of it.
Yeah. Yeah, and as long as we participate in a culture that would say boys will be boys, right, then nothing changes, right? Yeah. I appreciate Dr. Gaffney giving voice and identity to important biblical characters who we otherwise might not know a lot about. And even if the invitation is just to sit with the unspoken, unwritten stories of the characters who are named in the text, right, then we benefit from it. But how about as we heard in the last bit, how about the countless unnamed women who were victims of David's power as king? So I appreciate Dr. Gaffney do that. She's going to do this work, and it's good and important work, and she's really good at holding up a mirror to communities like ours to help us see more clearly who are we and what do we need to do. So I'm really glad that she's coming in March. I hope you'll be here for a part of that. Next Sunday is the first Sunday of Advent, so we'll have a new series. We're going to look at the poetry of Mary Oliver for 4 weeks. We'll have different presenters. The clergy are going to take turns presenting to you the poetry of Mary Oliver. And then we'll take a little bit of a break over the new year, and then we'll come back again together to do a little bit more of Dr. Gaffney's Womanist Midrash before she arrives. Glad y'all are with us, and I hope y'all have a great day. Thanks.